My name is Jessica. I'm 26, and I'm still in disbelief as I write this. Last Thursday's family dinner turned my entire world upside down. Sitting at our grandmother's antique oak table, my sister Caroline's perfectly painted lips curved into that cold smile I knew all too well before she delivered the devastating news. You have 48 hours to find somewhere else to live. This house belongs to me now. Mom and Dad sat there like statues, their silence confirming their complicity. How could they betray me like this? After losing everything and being at my most desperate, discovering my own family had orchestrated my downfall felt like being stabbed in the heart by the people who were supposed to protect me. Before I tell you how this nightmare unfolded, let me take you back to where it all began. I grew up in a beautiful Victorian house in Westport, Connecticut, with wraparound porches and a garden that seemed to stretch on forever. The house had been in our family for 3 generations, originally built by my great-grandfather in 1895. Every summer morning, I'd sit on the back porch with Grandma Rose, listening to her stories about the house's history while we watched the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "This house has seen so much love," she'd say, her weathered hands gentle as she tended to her prize-winning hydrangeas. "It chooses its caretakers carefully." Those moments with Grandma Rose were pure magic, especially when the rest of my family dynamics felt so complicated. Until 4 months ago, I was thriving as a marketing director at a prestigious advertising agency in Manhattan. I'd worked my way up from an entry-level position, earning recognition for campaigns that brought in millions in revenue. My corner office overlooked Central Park, and I was being considered for a vice president role that would have changed my life forever. Then the economic downturn hit our industry like a tsunami. "We're consolidating departments and eliminating redundancies," my supervisor explained with rehearsed corporate sympathy. After 8 years of dedication, 60-hour weeks, and missing countless family gatherings for work, I was suddenly unemployed with a job market that had essentially evaporated overnight. Moving back to my childhood home was supposed to be temporary, just until I could regroup and find a new position. When I arrived with my belongings packed into my sedan, Dad helped carry boxes while Mom prepared my favorite comfort meal, her famous beef stew with homemade biscuits. "Stay as long as you need, sweetheart," Mom had said, hugging me tight. "Family takes care of family." Those words would later feel like the cruelest lie imaginable. My relationship with Caroline had always been complicated. 2 years younger, but infinitely more manipulative, she turned sibling rivalry into an art form. When I won the state poetry contest at 15, she somehow managed to get food poisoning the day of the award ceremony, ensuring all attention focused on her dramatic hospital visit instead of my achievement. When I graduated summa cum laude from Yale, she announced her engagement at the family celebration dinner, completely overshadowing my academic success. Caroline married Marcus 2 years ago in what I privately called a strategic alliance, rather than a love match. Marcus Wellington came from pharmaceutical money and had expanded his inheritance through aggressive biotech investments. Their wedding was featured in Connecticut Magazine, with Caroline sending me the clippings even though I'd been her maid of honor. "Isn't it wonderful how perfectly everything worked out?" She'd coo, the emphasis on everything, making it clear she meant her good fortune, not family happiness. What hurt most was how my parents consistently favored Caroline despite her obvious manipulations. They attended every single one of her gallery showings, but missed my work presentations due to prior commitments. They proudly displayed her wedding portrait in the living room while my master's degree diploma was relegated to the hallway. Small slights perhaps, but they accumulated like poison over the years. Grandma Rose was different. She saw through Caroline's performances and made special efforts to support me. "You have depth, Jessica," she'd whisper during family gatherings when no one was listening. "Your sister is all surface shine, but you have real substance that will last." When Grandma Rose passed away 3 months ago at 91, I felt like I'd lost my only true champion in the family. Looking back, I should have recognized the warning signs much earlier. About 3 weeks after I moved back home, I started noticing strange behavior patterns. Hush phone conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered rooms. "We'll discuss this later," Dad would say quickly, hanging up the phone whenever I appeared. Once, I distinctly heard Caroline's voice through Dad's study door, followed by urgent whispers when they realized I was nearby. Mail addressed to me began mysteriously disappearing. When I mentioned expecting important documents from potential employers, Mom vaguely suggested that postal service had been unreliable lately. Dad started avoiding our usual morning coffee conversations, suddenly finding his newspaper fascinating whenever I tried to engage him. Most suspicious was Caroline's increased presence at the house. Normally, she visited maybe twice a month, always complaining about her busy social schedule. Suddenly, she was appearing 3 or 4 times weekly, usually when I was out job hunting. One afternoon, I returned early to find her, Mom, and Dad hunched over papers in the kitchen, which they hastily swept away when they saw me. The day of that fateful dinner, Caroline sent me a text. Important family meeting tonight. 7 p.m. sharp. Dress appropriately. The commanding tone was typical Caroline, but the formal nature triggered alarm bells. What family business could require such an official announcement? Mom spent the entire day in frantic preparation mode, making Grandma Rose's special roast chicken recipe, something reserved only for significant occasions. When I offered to help, she practically jumped out of her skin. No, I have everything under control, she said with a strained smile that didn't reach her eyes. Maybe just at the table with the good china. Dad was conspicuously absent most of the day, claiming he needed to handle business matters, though he returned empty-handed hours later. When he did come back, he immediately locked himself in his study, refusing to answer when I knocked to ask if everything was okay. That afternoon, while searching for references to include with job applications, I noticed several of Grandma Rose's photograph albums had been moved from their usual shelf. When I found them on Mom's dresser, multiple photos were missing, including several of Grandma Rose and me working together in her garden. A cold dread settled in my stomach, but I dismissed it as stress-induced paranoia. Our dining room had always been reserved for holidays and special occasions. That evening, it was transformed with crisp white linens, the crystal stemware that belonged to my great-grandmother, and candles that cast dancing shadows across the walls. The elaborate setup only intensified my growing anxiety. This wasn't a casual family dinner. This was theater, a carefully staged production for some significant announcement. Mom had prepared place cards, an unusual touch for a family of 4. I noticed immediately that my usual seat had been changed, positioning me directly across from where Caroline would sit, with my back to the windows instead of facing the garden view I preferred. A subtle power play, but it established the tone for what was coming. At exactly 7 o'clock, the doorbell chimed. Caroline arrived with Marcus in tow, though he hadn't been mentioned in her text. She wore a black designer dress more appropriate for a business meeting than family dinner, her blonde hair pulled back severely to emphasize her sharp cheekbones. Marcus looked distinctly uncomfortable in his expensive suit, constantly checking his Rolex, as if he had somewhere more important to be. "Jessica, you look comfortable," Caroline said by way of greeting, her eyes taking in my casual blazer and slacks with barely concealed disdain. There was something predatory in her expression, like a hawk circling wounded prey. Throughout the first course, conversation remained artificially polite. Dad discussed the weather with unusual enthusiasm. Mom kept jumping up to check the kitchen, though everything was clearly perfectly timed from years of experience. Caroline exchanged meaningful glances with our parents while Marcus maintained his business-like demeanor, treating this like a corporate boardroom rather than a family gathering. By the time dessert arrived, Grandma Rose's famous apple crisp that Mom had clearly spent hours perfecting, my nerves were completely frayed. I was about to directly demand an explanation when Caroline delicately placed her fork down, dabbed her mouth with her napkin, and cleared her throat with theatrical precision. "Now that we've enjoyed Mom's wonderful cooking," she began, her voice carrying that false sweetness I'd endured since childhood, "it's time to address the real purpose of tonight's gathering." She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a legal-sized envelope, sliding it across the table toward me with deliberate slowness. "As you know, Grandma Rose's estate has been finalized," Caroline continued, her eyes never leaving my face, watching for my reaction like a scientist observing an experiment. "What you don't know is that there were some last-minute changes to her will." She paused dramatically, her lips curving into that smile I'd come to despise. The house now legally belongs to me, and I'm giving you 48 hours to pack your belongings and leave. The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at the envelope, unable to touch it as if it might burn my fingers. My gaze darted to my parents, desperately searching for confusion, protest, anything that would indicate this was as shocking to them as it was to me. Instead, I found Dad suddenly fascinated by the tablecloth pattern, refusing to meet my eyes. Mom's face crumpled slightly, tears gathering, but her silence spoke volumes. "You knew," I whispered, my voice barely audible in the suddenly oppressive quiet. "You all knew about this?" "Everything is completely legal," Marcus interjected, his tone suggesting he was concluding a business transaction rather than destroying a family. "The documentation has been verified by multiple attorneys. The property transfer has already been processed. Your grandmother was of sound mind when she made these revisions." I felt the room spinning around me. But why? Why would Grandma Rose do this? She loved me. She loved this house. She always said. She said a lot of things. Caroline cut in sharply. The reality is that she ultimately recognized who deserved this property, who had built a stable, successful life versus who was. She paused, examining her perfect manicure before delivering the final blow. The family disappointment. The cruelty of those words knocked the breath from my lungs. I'd lost my job due to economic circumstances beyond my control, not personal failure. I'd been working tirelessly to rebuild my career.
How dare she?
"That's not fair, Caroline." Mom finally spoke, her voice weak and unconvincing. "Fair?" Caroline laughed bitterly. "Life isn't fair. The fact remains that I own this house now, and I have plans that don't include supporting my unemployed sister indefinitely. 48 hours is more generous than most landlords would offer." I turned to my father, the man who had taught me about integrity and standing up for what's right. "Dad, you're seriously okay with this? With throwing me out when I have nowhere to go? After you promised I could stay as long as needed?" Dad shifted uncomfortably, his shoulders hunched. "It's complicated, Jessica. There are legal realities we have to accept. The will is binding." "Legal realities?" I echoed incredulously. "I'm your daughter. This should be about family, not legal documents." "Don't be so dramatic," Caroline sighed dismissively. "You're 26, not 16. Plenty of people your age live independently without running home at the first sign of trouble." "Saturday morning, 9 a.m., she continued coldly. "I expect your keys on the kitchen counter and your things gone. Marcus is having the locks changed that afternoon." Mom was crying openly now, but made no move to defend me. Marcus began explaining something about property rights and legal possession, but his words became white noise as blood rushed in my ears. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "I can't believe this is happening," I managed to say, my voice shaking with rage and devastation. "I can't believe my own family would do this to me." Without waiting for a response, I fled the dining room, taking the stairs two at a time to reach my childhood bedroom. The same room where Mom had helped me with homework, where Dad had comforted me after my first heartbreak, where Grandma Rose had taught me to crochet during long winter evenings. I locked the door and slid down against it, finally allowing the tears to come as my entire world collapsed around me. That night was the longest of my life. Sleep was impossible as my mind replayed the dinner scene endlessly. Caroline's smirk, Marcus's cold legalities, Mom's tears, Dad's avoidance. I kept expecting someone to knock, to tell me it was all a terrible misunderstanding or a cruel joke. But the house remained silent except for occasional creaking as everyone retreated to their separate spaces. Around 4 a.m., panic about my immediate future set in completely. I grabbed my laptop and checked my bank account. $1,543.67, barely enough for 1 month's rent in Westport, and that was without considering security deposits or living expenses. The severance package from my job had mostly gone toward paying off student loans and credit card debt, a decision that now seemed disastrously short-sighted. I desperately searched rental listings, but the options were grim. Studio apartments started at $2,200 monthly, requiring proof of income 3 times the rent amount. Roommate situations demanded immediate move-ins and long-term commitments I couldn't make while unemployed. The possibility of homelessness loomed large in the darkness of my childhood bedroom, which now felt like borrowed space I'd overstayed. Frantically, I scrolled through my phone contacts, weighing who I could possibly call at this hour. Most friends had drifted away during my years of workaholic dedication. Those who remained were scattered across the country, building their own careers in tiny apartments with complicated lives. Who could I impose upon with such desperate, short notice? By dawn, my eyes burned from crying and screen glare. The first light filtering through my curtains felt like a countdown timer beginning. Day 1 of 2 before eviction from my family home. I waited until I heard movement downstairs before emerging from my room, having rehearsed what I wanted to say. Mom was alone in the kitchen, mechanically whisking pancake batter, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen. She flinched when she saw me. "How could you let this happen?" I asked without preamble, my voice raw from crying. Mom's hand trembled, batter dripping onto the counter. "We didn't have a choice, Jessica." "There's always a choice," I countered. "You chose Caroline." Again. Dad entered then, already dressed for his Saturday golf game, as if nothing world-shattering had occurred. He poured coffee, with deliberately slow movements. "The will is legally binding," he said without looking at me directly. "We consulted with our attorney. There's nothing we can do to change it." "You could stand up for me." I slammed my palm on the counter, making them both jump. "You could tell Caroline this is wrong. You could help me fight this." "Fight what?" Dad finally met my gaze, his expression hardening. "Your grandmother's final wishes? You want us to go against Rose's explicit instructions?" "I don't believe for one second that Grandma Rose wanted this," I said. "She loved me. She loved this house. She wouldn't have given it to Caroline just to have me thrown out." A flash of something, guilt perhaps, crossed Dad's face before he masked it. "Rose changed her will. We were all surprised, but it's done. Why are you both really doing this?" I pressed, noticing how they exchanged glances. "What aren't you telling me?" Mom busied herself, wiping up spilled batter. Dad sipped his coffee. The silence stretched until finally Mom spoke in a near whisper. "Caroline and Marcus offered to let us stay in the house permanently if we supported their position." The betrayal hit a new depth. "So, you sold me out to secure your own living situation." "It's not that simple," Dad protested weakly. "It seems pretty simple to me," I retorted, fighting back fresh tears. "You chose your own comfort over your daughter's welfare." I left them standing in the kitchen, their breakfast forgotten, and returned to my room to start making desperate calls. My former colleague Sarah answered on the third ring, her voice groggy with sleep. "Jessica, it's 8 a.m. on Saturday. Is everything okay?" I swallowed my pride and explained the situation, each word painful to articulate. Sarah's shock was evident through the phone. "That's absolutely horrible. Of course you can crash on my couch while you figure things out. It's not much, but it's yours as long as you need it." The relief was overwhelming but short-lived. Sarah's one-bedroom apartment in Norwalk would be a temporary bandage on a hemorrhaging wound. I needed income, permanent housing, and most importantly, answers about what had really happened to Grandma Rose's will. Between packing sessions, I submitted job applications frantically, lowering my salary expectations with each submission. I researched legal aid options, but without money for retainers, my choices were severely limited. Every potential solution seemed blocked by the same obstacle, my sudden, unexpected poverty. Late that afternoon, while sorting through old letters to determine what could possibly fit in Sarah's tiny apartment, I discovered a box of correspondence from Grandma Rose that I'd saved over the years. Her elegant handwriting brought fresh waves of grief. This woman who had believed in me so completely couldn't possibly have orchestrated my destruction. As I tenderly reread her words of encouragement from my college years, my phone rang with an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but desperation made me answer. "Is this Jessica Mitchell?" An elderly woman's voice inquired. "Yes, speaking." This is Dorothy Pemberton, your grandmother Rose's dear friend from the Historical Society. I've been trying to reach you since the funeral, but your mother said you weren't taking calls. I finally found your number in Rose's old address book. It's wonderful to hear from you, Mrs. Pemberton, I said, puzzled by the urgency in her voice and the misinformation about refusing calls. There's something very wrong about Rose's will, she said without preamble. She told me explicitly just weeks before she passed that she wanted you to inherit the family home. She was absolutely clear about it. My heart began racing. That's what I believed too, but apparently she changed her mind. Or someone changed it for her. Dorothy replied ominously. Rose's health declined rapidly in her final weeks, but even then she spoke of you with such love and pride. I found it shocking when I heard about the will's terms. Something doesn't add up, dear. For the first time since the dinner, I felt a flicker of hope. Mrs. Pemberton, would you be willing to meet with me tomorrow? I need to understand what really happened. Absolutely, dear. Rose would want me to help you. The truth needs to come out. As I hung up, I clutched one of Grandma's letters to my chest. Perhaps not everything was lost after all. If there was even a possibility that the will had been manipulated, I owed it to Grandma Rose and myself to discover the truth. The Riverside Cafe sat on a quiet street in downtown Westport, its weathered brick facade and vintage awnings a comforting contrast to the sleek boutiques surrounding it. Dorothy Pemberton had suggested it, mentioning that she and Grandma Rose had met there weekly for over 2 decades. As I pushed open the door, the familiar aroma of fresh bread and cinnamon brought an unexpected lump to my throat. Dorothy spotted me immediately, waving from a corner booth. At 79, she was remarkably elegant, her silver hair perfectly styled and her outfit coordinated with the precision of someone from an era when presentation mattered deeply. Jessica, dear, she clasped my hands in her surprisingly strong ones. You look so much like Rose at your age. That same spirit in your eyes. We ordered coffee, and Dorothy wasted no time addressing the situation. 3 months before Rose passed, we sat right at this table, she began, stirring her coffee methodically. She was excited because she had just updated her will. She told me specifically that she was leaving the house to you because, and I quote, Jessica is the only one who truly understands what this house means to our family's history. Tears stung my eyes. That sounded exactly like Grandma Rose. She mentioned that Caroline would receive her stock portfolio and jewelry collection, which were quite valuable, Dorothy continued. Rose believed in fair inheritances, but felt strongly that the house should go to you. Then what happened? I asked, leaning forward. Robert Phillips had been Rose's attorney for 25 years. But suddenly, there was this new lawyer, Bradford something. Very polished, very persuasive. He started visiting Rose regularly during her final weeks when the pain medication often left her confused and disoriented. Bradford, I repeated, making a mental note. Did Grandma Rose ever explain why she switched attorneys? Dorothy's expression darkened. That's what troubled me most. When I asked, Rose seemed genuinely confused by the question, as if she didn't remember making that decision. I tried to raise concerns with your parents, but they assured me everything was being handled properly. She paused, guilt evident in her voice. I should have pushed harder, but I didn't want to overstep boundaries. You're helping me now, I reassured her. Do you remember Bradford's last name? Morrison, she said after a moment's thought. Bradford Morrison. Very expensive suits, luxury sedan. Nothing like Robert, who drove the same Honda for 15 years. Armed with this name and Dorothy's promise to provide a sworn statement if needed, I headed to the local library to use their computers, not wanting to risk researching on family devices at home. Bradford Morrison's website was impressive and slick, specializing in estate planning for wealthy clients. What caught my attention was a testimonial section featuring someone named Wellington. With trembling fingers, I searched for Bradford Morrison Marcus Wellington and felt nauseous when the results loaded. There it was in digital black and white, a Connecticut Business Journal article from 18 months ago featuring Marcus accepting a humanitarian award, with Bradford Morrison described as Wellington's longtime legal counsel and close family friend. The connection was undeniable. I dug deeper, searching public records and social media. Buried in a year-old Facebook post was a photo of Caroline, Marcus, and Bradford at a charity gala, tagged with #businessfriends. The date corresponded with the period when Grandma Rose had been hospitalized for her final decline. Back at the house, I waited until my parents left for their weekly bridge club before slipping into Dad's home office. His computer was password protected, but he'd used the same one, our old dog's name, for as long as I could remember. Within minutes, I was scrolling through his email archives. What I discovered made my blood run cold. Email chains between Dad, Caroline, and Bradford dating back 4 months, discussing the revised estate plan and strategies for managing Jessica's expectations. One particularly damning message from Caroline read, "Once the transfer is complete, we'll honor our agreement about Mom and Dad's living situation. Just make sure Jessica doesn't suspect anything until it's finalized." I downloaded the emails to a flash drive with shaking hands, feeling physically sick. The depth of the conspiracy was staggering, but there was more to uncover. In a folder labeled Rose Medical, I found scanned copies of Grandma's hospital records from her final weeks. The attending physician had noted, patient frequently disoriented due to pain medication. Questionable capacity for major legal decisions. Yet the new will had been signed during exactly this vulnerable period. Even more disturbing was a financial document I found buried in Dad's files. Marcus and Caroline's investment firm was drowning in debt, with multiple properties facing foreclosure. They were on the verge of bankruptcy unless they could secure a significant asset like our family home to use as collateral for emergency loans. Everything suddenly made horrifying sense. Caroline hadn't wanted the house out of sentiment or spite. She needed it desperately to save her and Marcus's failing business empire. And my parents had willingly participated in this scheme to guarantee their own future security. I was still sitting in Dad's office, surrounded by evidence of their betrayal, when they returned home earlier than expected. Mom's face drained of all color when she saw the computer screen and papers spread across the desk. "Jessica, what are you doing?" Dad demanded, his voice rising with anger. "Those are private documents." "Private conspiracy documents, you mean?" I replied, my voice eerily calm despite the rage and hurt boiling inside me. "I know everything." Bradford Morrison being Marcus's attorney. Grandma Rose being medicated and confused when she supposedly changed her will. Caroline and Marcus being near bankruptcy. Mom collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. Dad's expression shifted from anger to resigned defeat. "You don't understand the complexity of the situation," he said weakly. "Then explain it to me," I challenged. "Explain why you helped steal your own mother's agency and my inheritance." Marcus approached us first, Dad admitted after a long silence. He showed us their financial statements. They were going to lose everything. Caroline was facing humiliation, possibly even legal trouble for some questionable business practices. "So you decided to sacrifice me instead," I said flatly. "We made the best decision we could for the entire family," Dad insisted. "Caroline and Marcus needed the house more than you did. They're married, planning for children. You're single with a promising career." "Had a promising career," I corrected bitterly. "Which you knew I'd lost when you agreed to this scheme." "We didn't know initially," Mom interjected, her voice small. "By the time you lost your job, things were already in motion. And you didn't think to stop them? To stand up for me when I was most vulnerable." The silence that followed was answer enough. They had known everything and chosen Caroline anyway. The favorite daughter had won again, this time taking everything that mattered to me. "They offered us security," Dad finally said. "A legal agreement that we could stay in the house until we're ready to move to assisted living. At our age, with my pension being what it is, we couldn't afford to relocate to this area." "So you sold me out for a place to live," I summarized, the betrayal cutting deeper with each revelation. "Did you even consider what would happen to me?" "Caroline assured us she'd help you transition to a new living situation," Mom offered lamely. I laughed bitterly. "And you believed her, knowing her your entire lives?" The crushing weight of their betrayal hit me fully then. My own parents had actively conspired against me, prioritizing Caroline's desperation and their own comfort over my welfare. The family I thought I could depend on had methodically planned my displacement while offering false comfort and empty reassurances. I stood on unsteady legs, gathering the evidence I'd collected. "I'm going to fight this," I said with more confidence than I felt. "Not just for me, but for Grandma Rose. What you've done isn't just morally wrong. It's potentially criminal." "Jessica, please." Mom reached for me, tears streaming down her face. "We're still family. We can work this out somehow." I stepped back from her touch. "Family doesn't do what you've done. Not to someone they claim to love." As I walked away, I felt something fundamental break inside me, the last remnants of my childhood faith in family bonds. The pain was excruciating, like a physical wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. I barely made it to my room before the panic attack hit, dropping to my knees as the walls seemed to close in around me. Between gasping breaths, I questioned everything: my childhood memories, my place in the family, my identity as a daughter and sister. If my own family could betray me so completely, what did that say about me? About the relationships I'd trusted my entire life? As the panic slowly subsided, leaving me hollow and exhausted, a strange clarity emerged through the emotional fog. I had less than 12 hours before Caroline's deadline. I could either collapse under the weight of this betrayal or use it as fuel to fight back. For the first time in my life, no one was coming to save me. If justice was going to be served, I would have to demand it myself. Day 2 of Caroline's ultimatum dawned gray and oppressive, matching my emotional state perfectly. After a sleepless night punctuated by anxiety and determination, I forced myself to begin the practical process of packing, a tacit admission that despite my resolve to fight, I might still face homelessness in hours. My childhood bedroom was a museum of memories. Each item I touched carried emotional weight: debate team trophies, Yale pennants, the vintage jewelry box Dad had given me for my 16th birthday. How could the same father who had spent an entire weekend assembling that gift now be complicit in my eviction? The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. I found myself moving mechanically, unable to decide what was essential versus what could be abandoned. How do you compress a lifetime into a few boxes? Sarah's apartment was minuscule, with barely enough room for a temporary air mattress, let alone storage for my possessions. Around noon, I realized I hadn't eaten since yesterday's disastrous dinner. The thought of food made my stomach revolt, but I knew I needed energy for whatever lay ahead. I ventured downstairs to find the house eerily quiet, with a note on the kitchen counter informing me that my parents were running errands, a transparent excuse to avoid confrontation after yesterday's revelations. As I mechanically assembled a sandwich I had no appetite for, the front door opened. My body tensed, expecting my parents, but Caroline's voice called out instead. "Just checking how the packing is progressing," she announced, appearing in the kitchen doorway with designer sunglasses pushed atop her head, looking infuriatingly fresh and composed. "Don't pretend this is a friendly visit," I said flatly, not bothering to hide my hostility. Caroline sighed theatrically. "I'm trying to be civilized, Jessica. This doesn't have to be unpleasant. You're destroying my life after manipulating our dying grandmother. There's no version of this that isn't unpleasant. Always the victim." She clicked her tongue dismissively. "For your information, I'm being incredibly generous. Most new property owners would give squatters just 24 hours notice. I'm not a squatter. I'm family." The word tasted bitter now, hollow and meaningless after everything that had been revealed. Caroline glanced around the kitchen with a proprietary air that made my skin crawl. "I'm thinking of completely gutting this space. Marcus knows an excellent contractor who specializes in modern gourmet designs. This whole farmhouse aesthetic is so outdated." Grandma Rose had personally overseen every detail of the kitchen renovation 8 years ago, lovingly preserving the home's historical character while updating its functionality. The casual dismissal of her careful choices felt like another violation of her memory. "Why are you really here, Caroline?" I asked, setting down my untouched sandwich. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Just ensuring you're on schedule. The moving company arrives Monday morning for furniture we're keeping. It would be awkward if you were still lingering." The deliberate cruelty took my breath away. After she left, I abandoned any pretense of eating and returned to my packing, tears blurring my vision as I worked. By evening, I'd filled 8 boxes and 3 suitcases, but had barely made a dent in my belongings. My parents returned, but maintained careful distance, moving around me like I was already a ghost haunting the house. The silence was deafening, broken only by occasional muffled conversations behind closed doors. Shortly before midnight, I retreated to the bathroom, the one space I could guarantee privacy. Staring at my reflection, I barely recognized the person looking back. Pale, hollow-eyed, hair limp and unwashed. I looked like a stranger to myself, someone who had been hollowed out and defeated. The weight of everything, job loss, betrayal, impending homelessness, crashed down on me at once. My legs gave way, and I sank to the cold tile floor, back against the bathtub, as silent sobs racked my body. This was rock bottom. Alone on a bathroom floor, betrayed by everyone I trusted, with nowhere to go and no viable plan. In that moment of utter desolation, my hand unconsciously went to my throat, fingers finding the delicate silver pendant I always wore, Grandma Rose's compass necklace. I'd put it on the day of her funeral and hadn't removed it since. With trembling fingers, I opened the antique compass to reveal its steady needle. A memory surfaced through the fog of despair. I was 14, lost during a family hiking trip, when Grandma Rose found me crying by a stream. "A compass doesn't prevent you from getting lost," she had said thoughtfully, sitting beside me on a fallen log. "But it always shows you which direction leads home. Sometimes, Jessica, the most important journey is finding your way back to yourself." She had taken my hands then, her grip surprisingly strong for her age. Never let anyone convince you that you're lost beyond finding. Some people will try to make you doubt your own direction, especially family members who are afraid of their own paths. But you have an internal compass that will never lie to you. Trust it, even when everyone else tries to point you elsewhere. I closed the compass, pressing it against my heart as Grandma's words resonated anew. I'd been so overwhelmed by the shock and pain of betrayal that I'd nearly surrendered to despair. But that wasn't who I was. That wasn't who Grandma Rose had raised me to be. The bathroom clock showed 2:43 a.m. when something fundamental shifted inside me. The grief and hurt remained, but alongside them grew a fierce, burning determination. Giving up meant Caroline won. It meant my parents' betrayal went unchallenged. It meant Grandma Rose's true wishes would be buried forever. I stood up, splashed cold water on my face, and looked myself directly in the eye. "Enough," I whispered to my reflection. "Enough wallowing. Time to fight back." I returned to my room with renewed purpose, pulling out a legal pad to formulate a comprehensive plan of action. By dawn, I had pages of notes, a timeline of events, and a list of potential allies and resources. I might have limited time and even more limited finances, but I had something Caroline and Marcus didn't: the truth on my side. I reached for my phone and sent a text to Sarah. "Change of plans. I still need that couch, but more importantly, I need your help fighting back. This isn't over." Her reply came almost instantly, despite the early hour. "Whatever you need. We're in this together." For the first time in days, I felt a genuine spark of hope. I might be at my lowest point, but from here, there was nowhere to go but up. The Legal Aid Society occupied a modest storefront between a laundromat and a tax preparation service in downtown Norwalk. The waiting room was crowded despite the early hour, filled with people whose desperate expressions mirrored my own internal state. I'd spent what remained of my savings researching legal options through the night, and this free consultation was my only hope of professional guidance without money for a retainer. After a 90-minute wait, I was ushered into a cramped office where Elena Santos introduced herself as a staff attorney specializing in elder law and estate disputes. In her early 40s, with practical wire-rimmed glasses and a no-nonsense demeanor, she listened without interruption as I laid out the entire situation, presenting the evidence I'd gathered. "This is extremely concerning," she said when I finished, examining the medical records and email printouts with a furrowed brow. "If what you're describing is accurate, We're looking at potential undue influence, questionable testamentary capacity, and possibly elder abuse. The timing of the will change during your grandmother's medicated state is particularly problematic. Can you help me fight this? I asked, trying to keep the desperation from my voice. The clinic can't represent you in a full contested will case. We lack the resources, she explained, making my heart sink. However, she continued, I believe you have a strong enough case to interest a private attorney working on contingency. If you win, they get paid from the estate recovery. She drafted a formal letter contesting the will and advised me to deliver it to all parties immediately, which would legally prevent any property transfers until the matter was resolved in court. She also helped me prepare a strategy for gathering additional evidence, emphasizing the importance of Dorothy's testimony and any other witnesses to Grandma Rose's true intentions. One more critical thing, Elena said as I was leaving. Document everything from this point forward. Every conversation, every text message, every interaction. You're dealing with people who have already shown they'll manipulate the truth to get what they want. Armed with Elena's advice and the formal contest letter, I spent the day building my case systematically. I contacted Robert Phillips, Grandma's original attorney, who expressed genuine shock at being replaced during Eleanor's final weeks. I'd worked with your grandmother for 25 years, he said over the phone, his voice heavy with concern. She never gave me any indication she wanted to change her will in that manner. In fact, quite the opposite. Just 2 months before she passed, she specifically mentioned how excited she was to ensure you'd always have the family home. Dorothy Pemberton connected me with 4 other members of the Historical Society who all confirmed hearing Rose express her intention to leave the house to me. One even had a birthday card from Grandma mentioning her joy about making sure Jessica always has roots in the house that raised our family. By Sunday evening, the final hours of Caroline's ultimatum, I had assembled a compelling collection of evidence suggesting the revised will did not reflect Grandma Rose's true wishes and may have been executed when she lacked capacity to make such monumental decisions. I arrived back at the house to find my parents' car absent, but Caroline's BMW parked prominently in the driveway. Perfect. It was time for the confrontation I'd been preparing for. I found Caroline and Marcus in the living room, casually discussing renovation plans as if the house were already completely theirs to transform. They looked up in surprise when I entered carrying a thick folder. We expected you to be finishing your packing, Caroline said, frowning at my empty hands and confident posture. Change of plans, I replied calmly. I've scheduled a family meeting. Mom and Dad should be home shortly. We don't have time for dramatics, Marcus started, but I cut him off smoothly. Make time. Unless you'd prefer I take this evidence directly to the district attorney's office instead of giving you an opportunity to explain yourselves. That got their immediate attention. Caroline's face paled noticeably, and Marcus's jaw tightened with obvious tension. 20 minutes later, my parents arrived home to find us sitting in tense silence in the living room like opposing armies preparing for battle. What's happening? Dad asked, noticing the unusual tableau and my determined expression. Jessica has apparently called a family meeting, Caroline said with forced lightness, though I didn't miss the nervous edge in her voice. Though I don't see the point when everything's already legally decided. Let's discuss how those decisions were actually made, shall we? I stood, retrieving my folder of evidence from my bag, with deliberate ceremony. Over the next hour, I methodically presented everything I'd discovered. Bradford Morrison's connection to Marcus, Grandma's medical records showing her diminished capacity during the will signing, the emails revealing the family conspiracy, the financial documents exposing Caroline and Marcus's desperate bankruptcy situation, and the testimonies from multiple witnesses about Grandma's true intentions. This is nothing but circumstantial speculation, Marcus blustered, but his legal bravado was undermined by the sweat beading on his forehead and his inability to meet my gaze directly. Tell that to the probate judge, I replied evenly. I've formally contested the will. No property transfers can occur until this is resolved in court. Caroline's composure finally cracked completely. You have no idea what you're doing, she exploded, jumping to her feet. We desperately need this house. Without it, everything we've built will collapse completely. You mean the house you were planning to use as collateral for emergency loans to save your failing business? I asked pointedly. The business that's drowning in debt because of your reckless investments and poor management. Marcus shot Caroline a sharp warning look, but she was too far gone to notice. It's not fair, she shouted, years of resentment finally spilling out unchecked. You always had everything handed to you effortlessly. The perfect grades, the scholarships, Grandma's constant approval and attention. I worked twice as hard for half the recognition. This house should rightfully be mine. So you manipulated a dying woman to steal what you wanted? I said quietly, my voice cutting through her hysteria. You took advantage of Grandma when she was at her most vulnerable and confused. She was barely coherent anyway, Caroline retorted defensively, immediately realizing how damning her words sounded. She barely recognized any of us near the end. What difference does it really make who inherited the house? At least we needed it for something genuinely important, not just because we couldn't maintain steady employment. The cruelty of her words hung in the air like poison. Mom gasped audibly, and even Marcus looked uncomfortable with the naked viciousness Caroline was displaying. Is that how you justified elder abuse to yourselves? I asked steadily. That it didn't matter because she was dying anyway? It wasn't abuse, Caroline insisted, but her voice wavered with uncertainty. Bradford simply helped her understand what made the most practical sense for everyone involved. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, holding it up for everyone to see. That's interesting because I thought you might say something like that, which is why I recorded a very enlightening conversation with Bradford Morrison this morning. This was a calculated bluff. I hadn't actually spoken with Bradford yet, but the effect was instantaneous and devastating. Caroline went completely white and Marcus looked like he might actually be sick. You're bluffing, Marcus said, but without any conviction whatsoever. Are we willing to test that theory? I held up the phone. Bradford was surprisingly forthcoming about the specific methods he used to persuade Grandma Rose. Something about scheduling document signings during her peak pain medication hours when she was most suggestible and confused. Marcus grabbed Caroline's arm tightly, squeezing hard enough to leave marks. We need to talk privately. Right now. He practically dragged her into the hallway, their heated whispers just audible from the living room but not distinct enough to understand specifics. My parents sat in stunned silence, the full reality of the situation seemingly hitting them for the first time like a physical blow. Did Bradford really admit to those tactics? Dad finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Does it matter? I countered firmly. We all know what really happened. The only question now is whether you're going to continue supporting this fraud or finally stand up for what's right. Before they could formulate an answer, Caroline and Marcus returned looking like condemned prisoners. Marcus appeared resigned to defeat, but Caroline was still seething with desperate anger. Fine, she spat venomously. Contest the will. Drag us all through a public legal battle. Expose every piece of family business to everyone. Is that really what you want? I want justice for Grandma Rose, I said simply but firmly. And I want the truth to be acknowledged and respected. The truth is that we're completely broke, Caroline shouted, tears of frustration and fear streaming down her face. Marcus's last 3 development projects failed catastrophically. We've been living on borrowed money and credit for months. Without this house to secure emergency financing, we'll lose absolutely everything we've worked for. Marcus winced visibly at this public admission of their financial distress and desperation. What my wife means, he interjected quickly, attempting damage control, is that we're experiencing a temporary cash flow situation that... Stop lying. Caroline interrupted him sharply, collapsing onto the sofa in defeat. It's over, Marcus. We're completely finished. The fight seemed to drain out of her suddenly, replaced by a defeated resignation I'd never seen in my always perfect sister before.